The More You Know, a podcast dedicated to learning and growing. My name's Krystal. I'm a diagnosed epileptic. Let's have a chat about anything and everything and expand our knowledge along the way. Hi. I'm not sure how I'm going to start the first one, I'm not going to lie. So this is the podcast called The More You Know. This is a side-along project that I will be completing alongside my blog. My blog is a place where I talk openly and lovingly about my problems, about issues, relationship, lifestyle, and I commonly talk about epilepsy. So from the introduction, I did say that my name's Krystal. For those, I can't imagine not many people are listening to this who don't know me. I'm 22 years old and I am a diagnosed epileptic and have been since officially March 2017. So I was thinking I wanted to talk instead of write. I feel like talking's more accessible. I feel like people are more likely just to plug their headphones in and listen if they have the time, if they were interested. This is catharticism for me as much as it is for someone who needs to listen to this. I'm not to say that each podcast will purely be about epilepsy, but for the most part, absolutely. So maybe I should say why I wanted to do this. I have a lot to say about epilepsy, obviously, if you take a look at my blog posts. And I feel there is a lot to say because not enough is said. That is mainly why I want to be doing this. I feel it's very common, and yet people know nothing about it, except for those around me in my life where I continuously go on about my diagnosis. But I'm willing to be that person who becomes irritating talking about their disability because I feel like the community ought to be a bit more outspoken. Those who have epilepsy shouldn't be embarrassed or afraid to hide it. And yeah, we've got to educate ourselves on the dangers of epilepsy, the reality of epilepsy, and what your lifestyle becomes after being diagnosed. So I was humming and hawing about where to start. I don't want to keep the first podcast too long. I wanted to start off by sharing my first seizure story, my first definitive seizure story. I say that because there are moments where I'm pretty certain before this I did have a seizure, but unfortunately I'm not too certain. I don't know that for sure. So this was my first seizure, called a grand mal. A grand mal. I have spoken about this quite a lot in my blog. People tend to recognise this seizure more than any other seizure. It is the one where a person becomes unconscious and they have violent muscle contractions or spasms. And this is the first seizure that I will be talking about in regards to my story. So, where do I begin? I was 18. I was stupid, pretty much. That's the story. So my fit was on a Saturday, because I remember that because it was after a night out. I was drinking. I think this was almost my second or third day drinking consecutively. I used to go on what you call benders. You fall asleep and you wake up and you continue drinking. I thought I was invincible, as many 18-year-olds do. As my dad says to me often, is you never think it's going to be you until it is, which is very true. I never thought my drinking could be the reason why I was then diagnosed. I'm not to say my drinking caused epilepsy. It's impossible. You have to be dispositioned to having seizures. But alcohol is certainly a trigger, which is something I would love to talk about in a podcast a bit later. So I was drinking. I started drinking at 4 p.m. I had been drinking the whole night before that as well, bear in mind. So I started drinking at 4. At 6 p.m, my friend picked me up after work and we went to hers and we continued to pre-drink at hers. So by this point, I'd already probably smashed down half a bottle of vodka. We then finished the vodka, most likely, and then went to a pub or a Spoons or whatever. Continued to drink there from about 8 o'clock until 10. And then from 10 o'clock till 3 p.m. or half 3, closing time of the club, I was drinking. So that's almost 11 hours of consuming alcohol. And I don't say this to brag because it's not an accomplishment, even though our generation seems to think it is that I could drink quite a lot. I could drink without being sick, which I used to think was an accomplishment until a more tragic situation overturned being sick. Back then, I'm not going to name names because of just privacy reasons, I had a boyfriend who worked at the club. So what I would do is I would wait until about 4 outside in the cold, wait in his car because he would give me the keys, and I'd just sit there. He came out eventually for 4:30, I'm assuming, I'm not too certain, and we went to McDonald's. I kept saying to him, I feel ill, I feel wrong, something's not right. This was pronounced to me an aura, which is a warning of a seizure, but 18-year-old Krystal did not know that. I thought I was going to be sick, which I then had a fear of being. I had a phobia of being sick. I kept telling him I feel strange, and he kept telling me that I was just a bit too drunk and that I needed to sober up. I couldn't eat the McDonald's, and then we went back to his. Bear in mind, I wasn't meant to be going back to his that night. I asked him if I could stay at his because I just didn't feel right, and he obviously was very kind and said yes. So we go back to his. I ask to sleep on the outside of the bed, so his bed was beside a wall, and I asked to sleep on the outer bit, so not beside the wall, whereas I normally used to sleep there. Because I said if I need to be sick, I need to be able to run to the bathroom. He was like, yeah, that's fine. Because I felt weird, I asked him to keep the light on like a 6-year-old child, and he happily obliged, bless his heart. So what happened from there? I tossed and turned for about an hour or two, and then this is where it kind of becomes sinister. This is where the seizure starts to kick in. I get up from the bed and I start pacing up and down, telling him I couldn't breathe. I kept repeating and repeating that I couldn't breathe. I walked towards the window and I started to claw at the window, but I couldn't open it because I wasn't certain how to open it. I think his window is quite tricky, actually. He was a light sleeper, thank the Lord, praise the Lord, very grateful. He got up and he opened the window for me because I was hysterical. I wasn't crying, but I was just hysterically talking and begging for him to open the window. So he opens it, and it's common for epileptics to say that they feel like they have an outer body experience. I remember seeing my legs climb onto the ledge of the window. I remember pushing my hands out to touch the outer bit of the wall, and I remember going to throw myself out the window because I was in the midst of a seizure, because I had drank too much. I'm not too certain. I was never a reckless drunk, but all I knew was that I needed to breathe, and I needed to be outside in order to breathe. Bear in mind, we're on the second floor, on the second story of his house. He and I will be internally grateful for this man. I owe him literally, and I mean quite literally, my life, because as I went to throw myself head first out a window, he underlocked his arms under my armpits and threw me back, pulled me back. He pulled me back. As he pulled me back, I don't remember anything beyond this point. The last thing I remember was trying to throw myself. He claimed, and I do no longer have him here to back this story up, but this is from what my memory concludes. As he pulled me back, I straightened my back. My muscles went stiff. My eyes rolled back into my head, and I fell backwards, which is very common with seizures. If you're having a grand mal, you don't tend to fall forwards, you tend to fall backwards. I don't know, because like I said, he is not here to say this, but I do not know if he lowered me to the ground. I do not know if I fell on him and he fell too. He was quite a strong man, so I assume he just lowered me to the floor when I became dead weight. I spasmed for about, not long at all, from 15 to 20 seconds. There's no average time for fitting. There's no such thing. Everyone's seizures are subjective. However, as I have said many times, if it goes beyond 5 minutes, you need to call an ambulance. If someone has a seizure once, comes to and has another one, an ambulance must be phoned. Those are the two occasions. Or if they have had a seizure and they have like cracked their head, or you see blood, or they have injured themselves, then you call an ambulance. Very important. Anyway, back to the story. I came to naked. In coming to, even though I was becoming conscious, I wasn't fully lucid. I took my clothes off because I was unbearably hot. Hot to the point where my skin felt like it was on fire after you exercise, and there's too much humidity. I asked him what happened. I think I asked him if I passed out. He said, "Krystal, I think you had a fit." I remember going almost, maybe it's a false memory, I'm not too certain, but I just remember thinking, oh God, oh goodness, because epilepsy runs in my family. We'll talk about genetics and epilepsy another time. That's another fun topic. I remember thinking, right, this is actually serious, because I knew it ran in my family. And I remember my stomach dropping when I realised I had to tell my dad. That was the hardest part, was telling my dad, because I knew it was as close to home for him. Anyway, I got him back to bed after I had a fit. My ex, by this point, because obviously he had been working was at the club, was absolutely shattered, so he got back into bed with me. But my adrenaline had spiked. Even though you're normally shattered after a seizure, I was so shocked that I had actually had a fit, that I couldn't sleep. So I probably begrudgingly let my partner at the time sleep for about 2 hours before I made him drop me home. And that is when I straight away decided to tell my dad. And from there, the rest, as they say, is history. I share my story openly to everyone, as I'm doing now, to educate, to help people understand, for catharticism too, because I could have died that night. I'm very aware. And that's very, very serious and very, very scary. Sometimes people have got to talk, but more importantly, people need to educate themselves on the reality of epilepsy. That's what this podcast will be about. We will be talking about a variety of epileptic related situations. I can discuss triggers. I can carefully, because I know I'm not a doctor, but we can talk medication. We can talk lifestyle. Lifestyle was a big thing that needed to change when I was diagnosed. I think for this podcast, for the first one, it's going to be quite short. The next ones may be longer. And I hope if I can convince my fellow epileptic flowers to join me on this podcast, we can hear other people's stories. I think that would be really healthy. I think that would be important. We can talk about the different kinds of seizures. Please do not judge what this podcast means to be. This podcast is creating a safe space for people who have been diagnosed with epilepsy, who will be diagnosed with epilepsy, because it is a common diagnosis. And it allows us to share experience, to learn along the way, to know that we're not alone. Because for the first, even sometimes now, I felt very alone and very isolated with epilepsy. I had a great support system, don't get me wrong, but nothing quite prepares you for your life to be shaken and turned upside down the way a disability does. This podcast is actually for me 3 years ago, for what I needed to cope and to get through. I hope you understand. I hope you enjoy, and I hope you learn. I hope you tune in to my next podcast, and I send you love, light, and happiness to my disabled flowers and my non-disabled flowers. Bye.